Araq al Amir, the Caves of the Prince, or the Cliff of the Prince, a cliff full of caves, 15 caves, is an archaeological site situated just outside of Amman, capital of Jordan. At the same site is a large ruin known as Qasr al-Abad, the Castle of the Servants or the Castle of the Slave. The remaining building is one of the best preserved examples of Hellenistic architecture extant in the Middle East. This place is counted as a minor tourist site. Families from Amman visit there for picnics and barbecues. It was restored by a French team in the decade 1976 to 1986 and then refurbished for tourists in the early 2000s. It can be difficult to find accurate information about this location, and much available information is either incomplete or contradictory. There are those who claim that the date and origins of the ruins are unknown and that conventional accounts are entirely amiss. More commonly, people don't know what to make of the site and the building because it is a monument from a period of tumultuous and complex history that is now forgotten and little known. Our present purpose is simply to clarify what we do know of this site and to place it within a meaningful historical framework. On many counts, it is a place of inherent archaeological interest and deserves far more attention than it receives. My own interest in this site is admittedly outlandish. There is a clear reference to it in the medieval work The Gospel of Barnabas. In that work, circa 1590s, the Barnabas author quite unaccountably and deviating from all canonical norms portrays Jesus as going to this place, following a war at a place called Mitzpah. Jesus is then joined by the 72 and the 12, we are told. He is seated upon a stone, the text says, and then many chapters of discourse on penitence follow. The text calls the place Tyro, the Spanish text Tyros. This can be positively identified as the modern-day Araq al Amir. In the Greek period, people from the northern city of Tyre relocated there. It was therefore known in Greek throughout the intertestamental period, the centuries BC, as Tyros. It is mentioned in Josephus's Antiquities under this name. The Barnabas text has Jesus go to a place called Tyro in the Transjordan. This is surely the place. It is certainly a strange reference. Identifying the place is easy, making sense of it is far more difficult. To reiterate, the Barnabas text describes a war at a place called Mitzpah. Then Jesus escapes to a place called Tyro, which we are informed is in the hollow part of the desert near the Jordan. At first we might think the Barnabas author's geography is wildly astray since it is such a weird text, but the notice checks out. There was a place called Tyro, or Tyre, or Tyros, exactly matching that description. For whatever reason, this late medieval apocryphal gospel, perhaps the most disreputable of all apocryphal gospels, presents Jesus and his disciples going there. What happens subsequently is that Jesus instructs his followers, mainly in dreary medieval sermonizing, while seated on a stone, it says, and then they all return to Judea. The text gives us nothing else. My task is to make sense of this reference. A step towards this is to clarify a few things about this location, its history and its archaeology. The earliest history of the site, they say, goes back to after the exile, so 6th century BC. In the settlement after the return, the Tobiad family, Ammonites, were shunned. Their progenitor was excluded from the temple, and they took up lands east of the Jordan River. Araq al Amir, in a fertile valley with permanent water, is the Tobiad heartland. In this case, our text and traditions can be confirmed by the archaeology. There are 2 inscriptions at the caves of the Tobiad name, Tovya, in early Hebrew or Aramaic. Conveniently, the Tobiads have left their signature on the place. The identification of the site as the ancient home of the Tobiads was further confirmed by archaeologists in the 19th century. The name Tyre or Tyros in Greek actually comes from the Hebrew zur, a stone. The same word persists in the Arabic name for the area today, Wadi Sir. Sir comes from Zur. This becomes Tyr than Tyros in Greek. It is the equivalent of the New Testament name Peter, a rock, a stone. It is curious that the Barnabas Gospel presents Jesus as sitting upon a stone. It might be just a casual prop in a medieval retelling, or it might reflect the etymology of the place. In context, it seems important that the Barnabas Jesus sits upon a stone at this place. Tyros means stone, so the Gospel of Barnabas has Jesus go to Tyros and sit upon a stone. It would seem unlikely that the medieval author had any insights into ancient Greek Hebrew etymologies, and yet the name Tyros comes with the apposite notice that at Tyros Jesus sermonized from upon a stone. It seems as though the text signals this connection. In any case, first in Hebrew, then in Greek, and later in Arabic, this location in the Transjordan, the Tobiad homeland, was known for its stone, the place of the stone. As for the history of the Tobiads, it is regrettably quite uncertain. They were caught up in the politics and priestly squabbles that led to the Maccabean revolt. Accounts of their history were largely written by their enemies or otherwise distorted. Aspects of Josephus's account of the Tobiads and Tobiad leaders in his Antiquities, which is our major source, don't make chronological sense and present other difficulties. Nevertheless, Josephus's description of their home at Araq al Amir seems to be substantially accurate and matches the archaeological evidence quite well. Drawing on his sources, which were possibly a Samaritan account, Josephus describes the place as luxurious, indeed a paradisos, a country estate with parkland in the Persian style, consisting of a marble stronghold or fortress, he says, with animals carved on the walls, surrounded by a moat or a canal or a lake, along with a defensible cave complex. Recent archaeology suggests the site was extensive, with water features and gardens, an oasis in the Transjordan wasteland. What we call the Qasr al-Abad, the castle of the slave, or the castle of the servant, or the palace of the servant, or however you want to translate it, was built, according to Josephus, by the Tobiad Hyrcanus. Here's the relevant description in Josephus, Antiquities, Book 12. Quote, Hyrcanus determined not to return to Jerusalem anymore, but seated himself beyond Jordan, and was at perpetual war with the Arabians, and killed many of them, and took many of them captive. He also erected a strong fortress, and built it entirely of white stone to the very roof, and had animals of great magnitude engraved upon it. He also drew around it a great and deep canal of water. He also made caves of many furlongs in length, by hollowing a rock that was near to him, and then he made large rooms in it, some for feasting, some for sleeping and living in. Moreover, he built courts of greater magnitude than ordinary, which he adorned with vastly large gardens. And when he had brought the place to this state, he named it Tyre. This place is between Arabia and Judea, beyond Jordan, not far from the country of Heshbon. Unquote. The central building, however, is not a fortress, as Josephus describes, but it is decorated with animal carvings, lion, eagle, and panther. The two panther fountains are quite unique. When it was built, it was situated within a large surrounding moat or lake. In some accounts, it is described as a palace. It is an example of luxurious Hellenistic palatial architecture, albeit with unique local adaptations. According to one modern reimagining, in its heyday the monument would have seemed like a huge ship floating in a body of water. It was undoubtedly quite impressive. One of the most curious decorative features of the Qasr al-Abad is a carving of a male lion suckling cubs like a female lion. Indeed, in its location, this carving was a feature. Why a male lion suckling cubs? Modern explanations for this are entirely unsatisfactory. Most of them start from the proposition that the craftsmen were ignorant of biology and didn't know the difference. This strikes me as very unlikely. Rather, the biological anomaly seems intended, but in that case the meaning of the unusual iconography eludes us. At this point, let us remember as essential background that there were two Greek players in the geopolitics of the intertestamental period. There were the Ptolemies, based in Egypt, and the Seleucids, based in Syria, enemies. Generally, we can say that the Tobiad sympathies were with the more tolerant Ptolemies and against the Seleucids, who were often hostile to Judaism and Jewish customs. The Tobiads favoured Hellenization in the Ptolemaic pattern, a syncretic Judaism. The enforced and severe Hellenization of the Seleucids provoked the Maccabean revolt and the establishment of an independent state, Judea, precariously sandwiched between the two Greek empires. Moreover, the Ammonite lands beyond the Jordan were often under Persian and then Parthian control. The political manoeuvring of the Tobiads over time involved positioning themselves amidst these various competing powers. Factional disputes within the Tobiads themselves concerned whether to continue supporting the Ptolemies' long-term control over Judea, or whether it would be more prudent for the Jews to deliver themselves over to the Seleucid kings and their more strident style of Hellenization. The Hellenistic sympathies of the Tobiads are clearly evident in the monument at the site. It hardly seems a Jewish building at all. Yet some have speculated that it may have acted as a temple. You will sometimes see it referred to as the Tobiad Temple. It is proposed that, excluded from Jerusalem, the Tobiads established an alternate temple at Araq al Amir. The archaeology is inconclusive on this point, but generally counts against it. It is more likely the surviving structure, at least, was a mausoleum. No altar has been found, nor other structural elements that would suggest a temple. On the other hand, the site also has extensive dovecotes. It was an ancient columbarium. Doves, it seems, were bred there for ritual sacrifice. We don't know very much about this. At each end of the cave complex are caves with extensive dovecotes. A papyrus called the Zenon Papyrus was discovered in 1918. It records a visit to a Tobias, a Tobiad name, by a businessman named Zenon in 259 BC. It reveals that at the time Tyros was being used as a military camp, a garrison, and as a centre for breeding animals, and that it was trading with the Egyptians. It was F.W. Albright who suggested the building there was a mausoleum. He argued, persuasively in my opinion, that the group of lion sculptures at each corner represent guardians of a typical Ionian Greek mausoleum, and that the upper eagles represent the messengers that convey the souls of the dead to heaven. It is suggested that the small rooms of the monumental lower story were for burials and the columnated upper story for funeral banquets. The Tobiads, in any case, were largely a political faction concerned with power and tax collecting rather than having essentially religious interests. It is a mistake to think that the conflicts in which they were involved were entirely religious in nature. Indeed, it is also wrong to think that the Maccabean revolt was entirely religious in nature, although that of course is how later pro-Maccabean writers portray it. In Ezra and Nehemiah, that is the 6th century BC, many of the clans returning from exile could not prove their genealogies and their claim to priestly office. Tobiah the Ammonite was in this category. Nehemiah had the Tobiads removed from their temple position and had the temple cleansed of them. The Tobiads, therefore, are proverbially those who are excluded from the Jewish temple, being deemed too syncretic for Nehemiah's pure Yahwehism. During the exile, Tobiah the Ammonite had been allowed to keep a room in the temple complex. Nehemiah expelled him. Today, in Christian ministry, you might hear the question, is Tobiah living in your temple? Tobiah, it is said in this reading, represents our carnal nature. The Christian moral to be drawn is that even though you can't banish Tobiah entirely, you can keep him from camping in your temple. That is instructive regarding the reputation and place of the Tobiads in biblical narratives. Nevertheless, they were not inconsequential, and despite being Hellenizers, they stood against the Seleucids and enjoyed popularity and influence in the lead-up to and into the Maccabean period. Josephus presents sort of folk tales about popular Tobiad figures. In this period, the intertestamental period, despite the odium imparted by Nehemiah, the Tobiads were involved in temple politics and in the family lines of the high priests. Regarding Hyrcanus, Josephus relates intrigues amongst his brothers, with Hyrcanus banned from Jerusalem. He retreated to Tyros and lived as a robber baron in conflict with the local Arabs in this portrayal. It seems that he expended his wealth building a garden city in the desert. The modern site hardly conveys this, but in the 2nd century BC, if not before, it was a vast, well-defended, luxurious family estate. Josephus says that when the political situation moved against Hyrcanus' supporters and Antiochus Epiphanes came to the Seleucid throne and expanded Syrian control into the land of the Ammonites, Hyrcanus committed suicide. Antiochus Epiphanes then put an end to the Tobiad stronghold at Tyros. This is sometimes the reason given for the building appearing to be unfinished in parts. It was a long-term project interrupted by Hyrcanus' demise. Here, for completeness, is a summary of Josephus' colourful and obviously stylized account of this Hyrcanus from Antiquities Book 12, Chapter 6. It goes like this. One day, a Tobiad named Joseph, nephew of Onias the high priest, became infatuated with a dancing girl in Alexandria and was determined to sleep with her. His brother feared what this indiscretion would do to Joseph's reputation with the Jews, and so substituted his own daughter for the dancing girl. Joseph was so drunk he did not know the difference, according to the story. Joseph's lust persisted, and the deception continued until the girl, his niece, became pregnant. After learning the truth, Joseph married his niece, and they had a son, this being Hyrcanus. Hyrcanus grew up to be more intelligent than his brothers and became Joseph's favourite. Then, one day, when the king Ptolemy IV of Egypt had a son, Joseph sent Hyrcanus to congratulate him. Unfortunately, Joseph sent Hyrcanus to his steward in Alexandria with an open letter of credit. Instead of taking 10 talents for a gift, as Joseph had ordered, Hyrcanus took 1,000 talents as the gift to ingratiate himself with Ptolemy. This impressed Ptolemy so much that he promised Hyrcanus his father's position upon his death. His father and brothers naturally took umbrage at this and barred his return to Jerusalem. In the stalemate, he therefore established himself in the family lands of Tobiah. Hyrcanus expanded his territory by fighting Arab tribes, Josephus then reports, and he built the magnificent palace which he called Tyros. Hyrcanus ruled the area for 7 years until Antiochus Epiphanes seized his land, and that was when Hyrcanus committed suicide. Most scholars regard elements of this story to be fanciful and others inaccurate. Josephus' assertion that Hyrcanus built the Qasr al-Abad is questionable, for instance. It is more likely, as some archaeologists maintain, that he refurbished the estate, which goes back to earlier centuries. All the same, the existing monument of megalithic marble clearly has Hellenistic features of the 2nd century BC. It is also questionable whether Hyrcanus committed suicide or even died at this point, as Josephus claims, or that Antiochus Epiphanes destroyed Tyros at this time. Josephus' chronology seems askew. What is the terminus date for this site as the Tobiad homeland? The Seleucids were preoccupied with other matters. It is more likely Hyrcanus and the site survived until at least 163 BC. There is a notice in the 2nd book of Maccabees, c. 5:13, that the Seleucid general Timotheus, quote, massacred about 1,000 men of our fellow Jews in the region of Tobiads, unquote, that likely signals the Tobiad estate being overrun. It is also worth noting that prior to this, in 2 Maccabees 4:12, the Hellenizing high priest Jason fled Jerusalem in 171 BC and came to find sanctuary in the, quote, Ammonite country, unquote, Maccabees 4:26, and very likely in Tyros with his cousin Hyrcanus, who was still alive and able to provide shelter at that time. In this period, sanctuary in Ammonite country strongly suggests the fortified garden estate of Tyros. This history is admittedly confusing and full of holes. The Tobiads, important players in this period, then drop out of history. Over time, the Ammonites were generally absorbed into the local Arab populations. In the Christian era, Araq al Amir was occupied by Byzantine Christians for many centuries. There is a Byzantine overlay in the archaeology that has eradicated the earlier layers. The cave complex, for example, had been almost completely cleared out during the Byzantine period. The site was severely damaged by earthquake in the 4th century AD. It is likely that the second floor of the structure collapsed at that time. Signs of the earthquake are still clearly evident today. There is a curious local Arab story about the site current in modern times. The local legend claims that a young man, a servant, sought the hand of a noblewoman in marriage. Her father demanded that he build a palace to prove his worthiness. The man did so, but the father, alarmed that the man had actually managed to fulfill the demand, had him killed because he didn't want his daughter to marry a servant. In the folklore of Wadi Sir, with the real origins of the building long forgotten, the building therefore represents something like futility and betrayal and thwarted love in folk memory. It is from this tale that the name Castle of the Servant comes. To summarise then, Araq al Amir is an oasis, a garden city, a paradisos in the land of the Ammonites, and was established by the Tobiads as their heartland after being excluded from the temple during the Ezra and Nehemiah period. The Tobiads were later advocates of moderate Hellenization that became connected to the Ptolemies in Egypt. On the cusp of the Maccabean revolt, one of their number, Hyrcanus, built or rebuilt the monument, a temple, a palace, a fortress, a castle, a mausoleum, what have you, most likely the family mausoleum, after retreating from the fraught religious politics of Jerusalem. What any of this has to do with the notice in the medieval Gospel of Barnabas remains a mystery. As I say, this strange late medieval work, Islamic in its polemic, presents Jesus and his disciples as going to this place. Why? Why does the Barnabas Jesus go to Tyros in the Transjordan? In the canonical Gospels, Jesus does go into the Transjordan, the Perea as it is known. It is perhaps possible that the medieval author or his sources just added Tyro to the canonical episode, plucking it out of Josephus. But why? Why would someone turn to Josephus's account of the Tobiads in order to add anachronistic details to Jesus' travels? Why this place in the Transjordan where Jesus sits upon a stone? The full notice, remember, concerns not just Tyros but also the war at Mizpah. The basic motif in the Gospel of Barnabas is that there was an outbreak of strife in Judea and Jesus and his followers fled into the Transjordan to Tyros. This is surely an allusion to the Maccabean revolt. It was at Mizpah, see the first book of Maccabees 3:46, that Judas Maccabeus called the warriors of Judah together for counsel and prayer at the outset of the rebellion. Quote, "For in Mizpah there was a place of prayer aforetime for Israel." Unquote. So Mizpah is the place where, it might be said, the Maccabean revolt began. This must count against the notice of Tyros in the Gospel of Barnabas being random or meaningless. If the war at Mizpah is the Maccabean revolt, or an allegory of the same, then the notice of Tyros is meaningful. It goes with Mizpah because the Tobiads go with the Maccabean revolt. Therefore, this section of the Gospel of Barnabas projects the ministry of Jesus into an intertestamental landscape, one in which Tyros beyond the Jordan, the place of the stone, was a safe haven from the political and religious vicissitudes of Judea, as it was to the Tobiads, and especially to Hyrcanus, sometimes known as the last of the Tobiads. Why the Gospel of Barnabas does this is entirely another question, but it does. Why does the medieval Barnabas project the ministry of Jesus into this period and place him at this location? The question adds an especially intriguing dimension to this little appreciated archaeological site.